What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I know it's been a minute, but we are back with another Magic the Gathering video and with Worlds wrapping up. I figured I'd go into the top 4 decks from Worlds, kind of talk about the decks that we got presented in the finals when it comes to MTG Worlds. It was pretty exciting watching the coverage. If you didn't watch it yourself, I'm sure there'll be highlights here on YouTube, or you can probably even watch the past VOD over on, say, somewhere on Twitch on the Magic's channel. But with that being said, let's just dive into the top 4 decks. Let's just talk about them, kind of break down like what showed up out of the top 4, what decks are kind of interesting. It's one of those things too with Worlds being over, kind of seeing what deck actually perceived, outplayed the other decks in the meta as a whole. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about it. So the first deck up here on the list is one of the many Epiphany decks that showed up for Worlds. If you don't really know what the deck really is trying to do, we're just trying to play a big card in the deck, which is All Runs Epiphany, essentially making us create 2 bird tokens that are 1/1s, as well as being able to take an extra turn. Where this deck actually becomes very powerful is even in a situation where it may look a little bit dire, we do play cards in the deck overall that are trying to copy spells with Galvanic Iteration, which essentially we can now copy our Epiphany, let alone depending on how much mana we have. We could copy it 1 time, we can copy it 2 times, or we copy this and then copy this again and then copy Epiphany and take 3 turns in a row and get 6 birds and take 3 turns and essentially maybe wrap up the game right then and there. The deck is very powerful and very explosive, even in, like I said, in situations where the deck does look dire against a very aggressive matchup. If you can kind of stall out long enough or hold down the battlefield, you can get into an all-run turn and essentially, like I said, take the game over. Besides running all runs epiphanies, it does also play Hall of the Storm Giants as being like another creature, especially in these, knowing these ideas that we're going to be taking multiple turns in a row. We could also start attacking with Hall of the Storm Giants if we have enough mana, also being more aggressive and finishing off the game. Other than that, the deck does play main board Burn Down the House, which is another interesting card that came from Innistrad, but essentially either it's some sort of board wipe for red where it deals 5 damage to each creature in Planeswalker, or we can choose and get 3 1/1 devils, which just creates more aggressive attackers, especially in these turns when we're going to start being aggressive and maybe trying to take down an opponent. Overall, the deck is very explosive, very interesting. It is pretty much like a control deck, and then essentially Epiphany is the way we try to win the game. We try to stall the early game, slow down the maybe aggressive attack that our opponent has, and then essentially get to that late game, hopefully cast an all runs Epiphanies, copied it, take multiple turns in a row, or just cast one turn after another and, essentially win the game that way. But going over the rest of the deck, we do play Fate and Hope, which I do think is going to be a pretty explosive unsummon that actually is pretty decent in the sense that if we actually target something that is converting mana cost 3 or less, we get to scry, which then we get to set up the top card of our library, maybe get rid of that land we don't really need in the late game, or maybe look for that answer on the top of our library. Spikevault Hazard here is definitely very good if you can ping something for 1 damage, send it to exile, or do it to your opponent's face. Or worst case scenario, if we need the red mana, we can always play it as a battlefield land tapped, which is definitely very good on the backside. Draw Disruption is also very good here, especially against aggressive decks, in the way that usually they try to tap down a lot of their mana so that the early turns are very, mana consistent. And Draw Disruption can, stop one of those spells as it being a counter target spell unless your opponent pays that additional 1. And in most cases, if they're, tapping out to play some sort of big spell, Draw Disruption disrupts that particular spell. Test of Talents, if you ever get met up against a mirror matchup, this card can, get rid of your opponent's, say, win condition. Like specifically, if you're playing against an opponent who's also playing All Runs Epiphany, you test the talents, their all runs, and then essentially look through their library and get rid of the rest of their all runs, or possibly any other spell that, they may try to use to, go over the top with and try to set you up that way. Then Expressive Iteration, I do think not just in Standard, this card is amazing in the sense of what it really does. We look at the top 3 cards of our library. 1 goes into our hand, 1 goes back into the library, and then 1 goes into our exile that we can then play or cast from that exile zone into play. Typically, this is where you're going to be digging for some maybe like a land slot, put a spell into your hand, and then put another spell that you maybe can't cast immediately into the library, or something that you may already have a copy of on the battlefield that you don't really need. Iteration is just definitely very strong 2 mana. Let's look at the top 3 cards of our library, set us up for success. So definitely a very good card. Then Galvanic Iteration, like I said, this card here is very big. Not only does it, copy Innocence or Sorcery spell, like All Runs Epiphany, so we get extra turns. It also has flashback, so we can play it again from our graveyard. And on top of that, it actually can copy itself. Therefore, then cast in All Runs Epiphany, then copy in 2 All Runs Epiphanies, taking 3 turns. It can also be used with any of your other spells in your decks if you want to, Memory Deluge a little bit deeper, Unexpected Windfall, double. even burn down the house for 10 mana or 10 damage across the board, especially if your opponent plays a lot of big things. That's definitely something you can do. And like I said, flashback makes this card even better. If it gets countered the first time, you can always in the late game play it from the graveyard if your opponent doesn't have any way to disrupt it from the graveyard, and recast it, and then take advantage of it that way. Shatter Skull Smashing is just a very good spot removal, as well as a land in case we need another red source that we can pay 3 life if we need to actually have it come to battlefield untap. If not, we can tap X and 2 red mana and do X damage to each creature that maybe we're trying to get rid of off the battlefield. Divide by Zero is definitely a very good card that gets around things where instead of that spell or permanent that's on the battlefield, it gets bounced to their opponent's hand. So if our opponent taps out to cast a spell, we bounce it back immediately to their hand. It doesn't get casted at all, so no enter the battlefield effects happen. We also get to learn, which I actually feel like in this scenario, the sideboard doesn't play a lot of learn cards. So depending on the situation, a lot of times I feel like you're gonna loot by drawing a card and discarding a card. So definitely a pretty cool idea here, having these in the deck to kind of set up for some success that way. Demon Bolt, I think, is in here. This card didn't really see a lot of play, essentially, outside, I feel like, Worlds, just because this card's here to kind of really disrupt maybe some sort of big creature that has some sort of big toughness, as it is a 3-mana instant that deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. This is another thing, too, that you can deceive your opponent by, foretelling this and having this foretold, maybe making your opponent think that it's an All-Runs Epiphany, and instead it's a 1-mana Demon Bolt to possibly a creature. This is also something that kind of disrupt maybe if your opponent's playing something like Is It Dragons, deal 4 damage to their dragon, or just 4 damage maybe to their chariot. So definitely a very good card that I do think was very key to a lot of the decks that showed up for Worlds to kind of play around those particular threats. So definitely a cool card there. Memory Deluge, yet again, another card that's definitely very good. Top X cards of your library, X is the amount of mana spent to cast a spell. So first time it's 4 cards, second time it's 7 cards, and you get to put 2 in your hand, the rest in the bottom of your library in any random order. So definitely a very good card to do at instant speed to kind of dig a little bit deeper into your deck, look for that answer that you maybe need against your opponent. Unexpected Windfall is another good card here. Discard a spell. As additional, we draw 2 cards and we create 2 treasure tokens. Creating those 2 treasure tokens could ramp us up, making those key cards that maybe those 2 treasures are key cards to cast that All-Runs Epiphany a couple turns earlier, possibly even copy it to have enough mana in that sense. So definitely a good card there. Definitely a good target for something like a Galvanic Iteration, just because we can copy this spell. We only still have to discard 1 card, but we get we get to draw 2 cards twice, and then we get to create 4 treasure tokens, so that's also very good. Like I said, Burn Down the House is kind of like that spot removal board wipe, as red and blue really don't have any way to disrupt the whole board. This is kind of that key card. Having 2 different abilities here, if our opponent's not playing creatures themselves and we don't really need that first ability, we can always cast it for the second ability and get the 1/1 red devil token creatures that whenever they die, it deals 1 damage to any target. They gain haste until end of turn, so they can attack it immediately the turn they come out into the battlefield. And then, like I said, All-Runs Epiphany. I do think the one thing that we did notice that came from Worlds is that a lot of the players who brought decks that were playing any sort of blue had this card in it for the most part. I think the only deck that didn't was, I think, the Teamer Treasures deck, which is another deck I'm going to go over shortly. But most of the other decks that splash blue or played blue had All-Runs Epiphanies. Like, the focus was playing around that card. And, with this card being a way to take extra turns in Magic, and especially if you can stack them, is a way to just kind of take over the game regardless of whatever the situation is. Because once your opponent's tapped out and you find that opening to possibly take those additional turns, there's not much your opponent can do, and you essentially wrap up the game and then in that way. And the mana basis is pretty straightforward. 2 of the Hall of the Storm Giants, 5 islands, 7 mountains, 3 of the Frostbolt Snarls, 4 of the Pathways, and 2 Field of Ruins. So definitely a pretty interesting deck. This is kind of like the basic copy, like turns copy deck. I think if you've been playing the Arena Ladder, you may have seen this deck pop up. Maybe not in its exact form, but with Worlds coming around and people seeing this deck and seeing how explosive it is, we may see a version of this pop up on the ladder. There's probably some cards that you probably would take out in certain situations, just because not all these cards are good outside of like a Worlds environment that's like a closed off environment. You may be able to swap out some cards and look for maybe some other cards, just because certain cards are only good against mirror matchups, and I guess people who are playing these decks kind of expected to play a mirror matchup or some sort of similar matchup. And then we go into the sideboard, when this is probably somewhere maybe to start looking at what maybe you can bring in depending on the situation. Spikefield Hazard, we have Malevolent Hermit, which is definitely a very interesting card that also popped up as being a very disruptive card, in the sense it's a 2 mana 2/1 with sacrifice, counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3 mana, so like a counter spell built into a creature. And then we can disturb him, and then non-creatures spells you control can't be countered. And then if it dies, it gets exiled instead of put into the graveyard. So definitely a good way to make our non-creature spells be prevented from being countered. So definitely cool there. Test of Talents, just get again for a little bit additional disruption. It's kind of one of those key cards if you don't expect to play a lot of spell decks. This is maybe a card that you would maybe not include in the main deck if you don't feel like you're playing a lot of this. But like I said, with the way the Worlds went, this may be a card that you may splash like a 1 copy of in your main board, just because I'm sure there'll be people playing Epiphany style decks, at least maybe until it gets banned. Then we got Burning Hands, which is good against the mono green matchup, which there were still 2 mono green decks, I think, in Worlds. Smoldering Egg is a very good card. I do think this is maybe one of those cards if you want to be a little bit more aggressive, especially in a best of 1 ladder. You may include this into your 2-drop slot just because if you can flip it and then whenever you cast insert a sorcery spell after you get the amount of tokens you need on it, it deals 2 damage to any target. So it starts, pinging your opponent's creatures or pinging your opponent's life total. Environmental Sciences for the lesson, Teachings for the lesson. Goldspan Dragon's good, especially if you're trying to be more aggressive. If your opponent's playing maybe a slower version of the deck, Goldspan Dragon is definitely very good. Maybe this is something you also include in the main board too. Kind of make it a little bit more into Is It Dragons in a way in turns. And then Mascot Expedition as the last card. Just another lesson that we can copy and get double copies of this and just kind of take over that way. But overall, this is a very interesting deck. Andre, he did very well. I think day 1 from what I saw, he was undefeated if I'm not mistaken. I didn't really watch too much of his coverage day 2 or today, I guess, I'm recording after the Worlds has kind of, finished. But overall, he had a very good Worlds, and this was his deck list, and it played very well against the other decks that popped up in the meta at Worlds as a whole. So with that being said, let's move on to the next deck list. Let's talk about it. So the next deck up on the list is a deck list that looks very similar to the last one with a couple different changes. This essentially is Grixis Epiphany. So essentially this player was playing black in it to kind of combat maybe a little bit of the aggro as well as a little bit of maybe the mirror. Playing some key cards that kind of disrupt maybe what they're trying to do. A cool card that's added into this deck that I feel like worked very well, especially in a very Epiphany heavy deck, was actually Celestis, as this is one of those cards that benefits from it changing from night to day, and then you can actually tap out and change it automatically from night to day or day to night by tapping 3. And what that would do is it will gain you 1 life, you get to draw a card, and if you do, we get to discard a card. So it just gives you that card advantage in that sense. Other than that, like I said, it's mostly very similar to what we've seen. You get the Prismari command in this deck, just as an idea, against maybe like mono green decks that are playing like Chariot, or maybe against maybe a mirror matchup that also could be playing Celestis, disrupting, by destroying target artifact, 2 damage to any target, create treasure token, which is always very good, which helps us ramp, and then drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards and making over 2 cards that are really useless in the matchup. But overall, very interesting card to include in the deck, just based on what we've seen as in general. Like, I'm sure a lot of these people who prepared for Worlds played a lot of matches and just really trying to figure out what people are going to bring. I guess playing ladder is one way to kind of figure it out, but yet again, a very interesting card to kind of counter like those decks that play maybe artifacts that they need to disrupt. Other than that, I'm just trying to think here what's in the deck that may have not been in other like the other version of the deck. Has Galvanic Iteration, has Expressive Iteration. This deck includes 1 copy of Smoldering Egg in the main board. Also includes Cinderclasm, maybe against those decks that are low to the ground, which is definitely very good there. Catholic Pyre, which is another good card in the sense that deals 3 damage for 2 mana to target creature or planeswalker, or we can discard up to 2 cards and draw that many cards. And then it plays, a little bit of black for some Power Word Kill, Blood Chief's Thirst, as well as the rest, maybe trying to, pull out or yoink up a key card maybe from a mirror matchup. Other than that, I mean, the deck list is pretty similar to the one we just went over before. Has a lot of one-ofs, I guess, to kind of, has a little bit of this, a little bit of that, depending on the matchup. And then I guess when you go into the sideboard, you can then double up on some of those things. You can bring another copy of Duress. You can bring another Malevolent Hermit into the deck. A couple more copies, another copy of Power Word Kill. Go Blank is another interesting card here in the sense that, making your opponent discard 2 cards, then exile other cards from that graveyard, which gets rid of any cards with flashback or disturbed. And in certain situations, your opponent may only have 2 cards, so definitely a good way to empty their hand. Soul Shatter is a good card that doesn't really technically target a creature that your player controls, so it gets around Goldspan Dragon, but makes them sacrifice their highest mana value card out of all their creatures. Unexpected Windfall for that little bit deeper card draw, which you can kind of shift the deck from maybe being Grixis and maybe just into the more standard Epiphany. Mind Flayer, another interesting card that kind of takes over or takes an opponent's creature, makes it yours as long as this is on the battlefield. So definitely like a cool little bit of Mind Control, which is definitely very good there. Cyclone Summer just disrupts maybe what your opponent's going to do, just like, gets rid of all the tokens, gets rid of all the creatures back to their hands, and everything on the battlefield that's as long as it's a giant stays on the battlefield. So definitely cool there. Definitely one of those cards you saw in like Simic, Simic ramp. So definitely a cool card that's included in this board. Other than that, I mean, this deck list is very interesting. I didn't see a lot of Jean, play, unfortunately, so I don't really know how he did overall, but he did make top 4, which is a plus. I do think I saw a highlight in between one of the matches where I think I saw him copy his go blank and actually make his opponent discard 4 cards, which then essentially got rid of their whole hand and then exiled their whole graveyard. So definitely interesting combinations that you can do there. But like I said, he built to kind of looks like to play against a mirror matchup as well as possibility of playing some more of the aggro decks in the meta. But overall, he did very well. I think he was number 4 out of everybody, but overall pretty cool deck nonetheless. So now we have Eugene Emmanuel. He was the one who I think faced Yuta in the finals of the MTG Worlds. And he played Teamer Treasures, which is a very interesting deck list. This deck is more so aggressive in the sense it's like a mid-rangey aggressive deck. But overall, what it's trying to do is trying to get just treasures out onto the battlefield and just be as aggressive as possible and hit your opponent as hard as possible, as quick as possible. The deck list is pretty cool on what it's trying to do. I mean, if you haven't seen some sort of Gruul deck, this deck just includes a little bit of blue here for the negate, just maybe disrupt maybe those Epiphany decks, as well as maybe some stuff in the sideboard to possibly counteract yet again more aggressive big spell decks as we have disdainful strokes in the sideboard. But overall, pretty cool deck list. You have 1 copy of Disbar Sentinel, which we can tap down another untapped creature we control, add 1 mana of any color. Which, if you play this on turn 1, play like a Magda on turn 2, we can tap Magda, which then creates us a treasure token. Then we create a mana to then, play an additional spell, which is definitely cool. So an overall very good creature, has reach as well, so it makes a decent chump blocker in case someone's trying to fly over. Or maybe if your opponent Epiphanies, you can always reach and get one of the birds with it as well. Negate, like I said, is in the main board here, just as I would assume Jean was, playing this just to maybe have something in the main board to kind of disrupt possible Epiphanies or possible copy target spell kind of cards, because if you disrupt that, then you can only cast 1 copy instead of casting multiple copies, so definitely a good disruption there. Dragonfire, because it does play Goldspan Dragon, so we can target this spell with Goldspan Dragon to do 4 damage to our creature or planeswalker, or if not, it deals 3 damage regardless, so definitely a good card there. Magda in here for that little bit of ramp. It's like kind of one of those things that every time it taps down, we get to create a treasure token. The treasure tokens essentially give us more mana to then play more things, so definitely good there. Innkeeper to kind of try to keep the life total higher, also creates a treasure token, which is also very good. So just overall, every time we play a creature, we'll gain a life point. Every time, when it comes out initially, we'll get a treasure token. And in that sense, it allows us to kind of play more expensive things earlier in the game overall. Ranger class, which by itself is a great card because it makes a 2/2 token, puts +1/+1 counters on target attacking creatures, which makes the deck overall more aggressive. And in the 4 mana, we can actually look at the top cards of our library and play creatures off the top of our library to kind of, get rid of creatures, be more aggressive on the battlefield as a whole. Shadow Skull Smashing as either the land side or possibly, getting rid of some pesky creatures on the battlefield by tapping X into red. Then we got Reckless Stormseeker, which then turns any of our creatures that we play out afterwards into, +1/+0 hasters. Essentially, every time we go to combat, which is definitely very cool. And we flip it over, they get +2/+0, trample, and haste until end of turn. So it allows us to be even more aggressive and gives us trample, which definitely goes over those small chump blockers that our opponent may play. Yeah, Moonveil Regent. It's a 4 mana 4/4. Whenever we cast a spell, we may discard your hand. If we do, we draw a card for each of that spell's colors, and whenever it dies, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of colors among permanents we control. So we have, 3 different color permanents on the battlefield. We'll deal, 3 damage to any target. So definitely cool there. Asika's Chariot, yet again, here for the aggressiveness. This card is another card outside of Epiphany that I feel like a lot of people see a lot of and also aren't really a biggest fan of, but this is yet again, copies tokens on the battlefield whenever it attacks. Allows us to be more aggressive, get more wide against our opponent as a whole. And then Goldspan Dragon, yet again, another card that back even before Innistrad came out, is the Prismari decks. This is a key card that just helps us ramp up even more. Turns our treasure tokens from being just tap it to sacrifice for 1 mana, taps them to sacrifice for 2 mana of any one color. So allows us to be even more aggressive against our opponent. And then the mana base has 2 Den of the Bugbears, to be aggressive, create more creatures on the battlefield. 1 mountain, 5 forests, 2 copies of Layer Hydra, yet again an X and a green, and create an XX Hydra creature token where X can't be 0, so it's at least a 1/1. 4 River Glides, 4 Crag Grown Pathways, and 4 Bark Channel Pathways. So overall, very interesting list. The mana, the sideboard here, if you're into it, I think is built around possibility of playing any decks that have green in it, playing things that have flying, and just maybe being more aggressive, especially against maybe those Epiphany decks. Just playing more creatures that are going to try to hit your opponent as hard as possible, as quick as possible. So Disdainful Stroke to counter big spells, Burning Hands to get rid of green things, Tangled Trap to get rid of things in the air or destroy target artifact. Naturalist is kind of one of those things that help us ramp and go a little bit quicker. Stormseeker, yet again, be more aggressive. And Briarbridge Tracker, yet again, another card that's pretty decent because treasures count as tokens, and it comes into play. We get to create a clue token, which then we can tap 2 and sacrifice to draw a card. So overall, decent card because it's a 4/3 with Vigilance, which is definitely very good and very aggressive, so it can attack and also stay on defense. And then we get to draw a card. So overall, pretty cool deck. I believe he was the runner-up in Worlds, but nonetheless, the deck was pretty cool from what I saw. It just, unfortunately, he kind of just didn't have enough to win against the eventual champion, which is Yuta's deck, which we'll go over in just a second. And the last deck up here on the list is Yuta Takahashi's deck. And essentially, he's playing Prismari Dragons for the most part. Nothing really too crazy about the deck that you may have not already seen if you've been playing Magic since before Innistrad came out. There's maybe a couple additional cards that have been added to the deck that weren't originally in it when Innistrad, before Innistrad came out, that wasn't in the original Prismari list. But it's nothing really crazy here that has changed too much to make it very, very much different than what it already had. The main board has 1 copy of Fadent Hope, just as an unsummon and possible scry. Spikefield Hazard as a ping 1, possibly exile, or play as a land into play tapped. Disruption, yet again, something to kind of slow down your opponent's maybe aggressive, tapping out in the early game. The gate possibility here. In case maybe you get a mirror matchup and your opponent's playing like an Epiphany or something. So just a way to counter Dragon's Fire because we are playing dragons. It's always a good spell to kind of get rid of your opponent's creatures if they have any. Smoldering Egg because we are playing dragons. This is a great card to kind of, take advantage of us playing a lot of non-creature spells that are in the deck and then eventually get a dragon that's a 4/4 flyer. Thunder Rebuke is a great card as well. 2 mana, 4 damage to any target creature or planeswalker. Expressive Iteration is a very strong draw 3 or draw 1, exile 1, put 1 back in the library card for 2 mana. Shatterskull Smashing because the modal land is a very strong kind of thing. Like you either can ping creatures or put in the battlefield as a land by paying 3 life untapped, or just having it come battlefield tapped. Divide by 0, very solid card. Bounces spells back to our opponent's hand, bounces permanents back to our opponent's hand. We also get to learn, which we can either loot by discarding a card and drawing a card, or we can go to the sideboard and actually get a lesson. Dissipate, which exiles target spell that was countered this way. Then it's all come in as well. Prismari Command, yet again, kind of those choices depending on what the situation is. 2 damage to opponent's creature, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, target player creature's treasure token, or destroy target artifact. Remember, Deluge, just a very strong kind of let's look at the top 4 cards of our library, and then later in the game, 7 cards, put 2 into our hand, rest in the bottom of our library in any random order. Goldspan Dragon as being the big card in the deck, as being our way to aggressively attack in and beat down our opponent that way by creating a bunch of extra mana to maybe disrupt maybe what they're going to do, or possibly have a follow-up spell afterwards. And then Alrund's Epiphany, just to kind of take those additional turns to maybe take over the game and just finish off our opponent. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 2 of the Hall of the Storm Giants. We have 7 islands, 4 mountains, 3 of the Snarls, and 4 of the River Glide / Lava Glide pathways. And then the mana base is pretty much trying to counteract maybe possible mirror matchups and also other Epiphany decks in the meta. We have Fadent Hopes as another bounce spell. Benevolent Hermit just as a kind of aggressive creature, also counter spell built into it. Test of Talents in case we get, like I said, get matched up against another mirror matchup. Burning Hands against green. Synclasm against maybe some tokens. Environmental Sciences in case we need to fix the mana. Heated Debate just in case we need to just kind of kill a creature and not have it get countered. Prismari Command against decks that probably play artifacts, and then Mascot Exhibition just as a way to kind of be more aggressive as well. Nonetheless, I mean, this is the deck that won Worlds. The deck, like I said, is a deck that I believe Yuta knew how to play, played it a very much maybe prior to Innistrad coming out, got very comfortable with it with the additions of the cards that came from Innistrad. It's a very solid deck. There's not too many holes in it, and it's not trying to be too aggressive and trying to win off of like an all runs combo and trying to hit multiple all runs epiphanies. In that sense, it's just doing, being like a tempo-y, mid-rangey style deck that's just trying to take over the game by getting to turn 5, playing their Goldspan Dragon, and just beating down your opponent and winning that way. Nonetheless, I mean, it's definitely a very good deck. And I mean, these are decks that are playable at MTG Arena, I think, as of recording for the next like 12 hours or so. So possibly by the time you see this up on the channel, the event is probably already over. But I'll have all the deck lists, or I'll have the link to the deck list from the Wizards article that kind of shows off the top 4 deck lists. Let me know which ones were your favorite, if you watch any of the coverage, which decks you may have liked that I may have not got over. But with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, I'll see you later.